the fairy or fae of Europe and Daemones of Hellenic antiquity, the Jinn of Arab folklore, the Yokai of Japan, Yaogwai in China, the Iwa of the African Yoruba, and Canotila of the Lakota Native Americans. Tradition populates the cosmos with intelligences, and, in particular, traditions the world over imagine an order of beings between mortal humanity and the immortal gods or angelic race. The medieval European knew the fairies are not angels, just as his Greco-Roman antique forebearer distinguished between Daemones and the higher Olympian gods. To the Muslim, the Jinn are not angels, the Yokai is not a kami, the Iwa is not an Orisha, the Canotila is not a Wakan or holy one. Everywhere, this order of being is thought to be invisible most of the time, made of finer stuff than us, swifter than the human eye, in a phrase closer in composition to the angels or gods, higher than man. And yet that does not make them better, more moral. They range from noble to mischievous to outright malevolent. This is Peter Bryan, a man from Wexford, Ireland, who in 1966 was convinced that fairies inhabited a tree on his property.
Well, what about the fairy field now, where they've changed it to?
I wouldn't meddle with it. And God between us and all harm, I don't want to see anyone around here meddling with it, with that enchanted place.
And this is Tim Hayes, fellow Irishman who decided to spend the night underneath a fairy fort.
I just want to prove to the whole world that there's no such a thing as a fairy.
You're a man who obviously doesn't believe in fairies.
I don't believe in fairies. Although I've been warned by several people not to go down, even to go near the fairy fort.
Belief in an unseen realm of not quite angelic, not quite demonic beings has remained widespread even into the modern era in some places.
No one's going to come out here at night. Because of the spirits?
Yeah, they say they'll get hunted.
Hunted?
Yeah, there's some spirits out there, they say, that could mess with you and all that.
Once the sun goes down, everybody's supposed to be at home because that's the time when the spirits come out. Just like the Navajos have a skinwalker.
Yeah.
They were used in good and bad.
This fear of territorial spirits and the sense that some may be ill-intentioned points us to an important element of the lore, namely the demonic aspect of much of fairydom. But before we get there, let's look at the ancient world's scientific, quote, definition of spirits. The European Middle Ages inherited its understanding from the intellectual climate of the late Roman antiquity, which in turn was rooted in Greek philosophy. The idea here was that this is a species native to the air, that there is too wide a gap between humans and gods, or humans and angels, in Christian terms, and that nature, abhorring a vacuum and not having any gaps, would have included some creature that was like mankind in ways that angels aren't, and like the angels in ways that humans aren't. The Middle Platonist Plutarch held this opinion.
Under God, Plutarch places those beings whom he styles genii or daimones of a middle nature between divine and human, for he thinks it absurd that there should be no mean middle between the two extremes of an immortal and mortal being.
Another pre-modern theoretical assumption that made the existence of fairies necessary was the idea that every environment should have its own native creature. We know that there are insects burrowing underground, and we know animals stomp about on the Earth's surface, but what of the air? Birds cannot be the native inhabitants of the air because they cannot rest there. They don't float. They must always come and rest on some fixed thing, and their bodies are as dense and meaty as the wingless animals. This seems like a strange way to think for us, but not so in antiquity. Apuleius expressed this view as C.S. Lewis explains.
About these middle spirits, or daemones, Apuleius has much to tell us. They naturally inhabit the middle region between earth and ether, that is, the air which extends upwards as far as the orbit of the moon. The daemones have bodies of a finer consistency than clouds, which are not normally visible to us.
This conception survives into the Middle Ages and in fact was quite widespread to the point that the Bishop of Lyon in France, the Spanish-born Agobard, complained of how many people believe in a floating city above the clouds, Magonia, and reported seeing ships come down from it, and even their inhabitants.
We have seen and heard many men plunged in such great stupidity, sunk in such depths of folly, as to believe that there is a certain region, which they call Magonia, whence ships sail in the clouds in order to carry back to that region those fruits of the earth which are destroyed by hail and tempests. And the sailors who pay rewards to the storm wizards themselves receive corn and other produce.
On this question of beings made of air, we have the following report from the dawn of the modern era about a strange encounter in 1491.
August 13th, 1491. When I had completed the customary rites, at about the 20th hour of the day, 7 men duly appeared to me clothed in silken garments, resembling Greek togas. When asked who they were, they said that they were men composed, as it were, of air, and subject to birth and death. It was true that their lives were much longer than ours, and might even reach to 300 years' duration. They remained with my father for over 3 hours, but when he questioned them as to the cause of the universe, they were not agreed. The tallest of them denied that God had made the world from eternity. On the contrary, the other added that God created it from moment to moment, so that should he desist for an instant, the world would perish. Be this fact or fable, so it stands.
And in Christian tradition, we have the curious story of Saint Anthony the Great, 3rd and 4th century, encountering a faun and a centaur, supernatural creatures from pagan antiquity. Concerning the first, we have this record.
Before long, in a small rocky valley shut in on all sides, he sees a mannequin with hooked snout, horned forehead, and extremities like goat's feet. When he saw this, Antony, like a good soldier, seized the shield of faith and the helmet of hope. The creature nonetheless began to offer to him the fruit of the palm trees to support him on his journey, and as it were, pledges of peace. Antony, perceiving this, stopped and asked who he was. The answer he received from him was this: I am a mortal being, and one of those inhabitants of the desert whom the Gentiles deluded by various forms of error worship under the names of fauns, satyrs, and incubi. I am sent to represent my tribe. We pray you in our behalf to entreat the favor of your Lord and ours, who we have learned came once to save the world, and whose sound has gone forth into all the earth. As he uttered such words as these, the aged traveller's cheeks streamed with tears, the marks of his deep feeling, which he shed in the fullness of his joy. He rejoiced over the glory of Christ and the destruction of Satan, and marveling all the while that he could understand the satyr's language.
The airy nature of such beings and the fact that some are corrupted led St. Paul to call demons powers of the air in Ephesians, and that term is still used in Christian tradition. Some traditions, like the Islamic, describe them as made of smokeless fire rather than air, but we should remember that in antiquity, the air above us was thought to have fire, writes C.S. Lewis.
Fire, the lightest element of all, whenever it was free, has flown up to the circumference of nature and forms a sphere just below the orbit of the moon.
Beyond this, the ancient and medieval conception was that the human being is a microcosm, a small cosmos, and the cosmos is a macroanthropos, a large human, meaning everything in creation corresponds to something in us, and God has made us the center of it all. This was how medievals thought. So then the animals correspond to our bodily instincts and needs, the angels to our reason, our intellect, and in between these we have the mind, the psyche, which can either understand and express higher truths through language and images, or grow ignorant and confused. Therefore, A third kind of creature, not animal and not angel, which can be good or bad, helping us towards virtue or away from it, must exist. And these dwell under the moon, for that is the realm of change, where things can be good or corrupt, whereas in the traditional worldview, the spheres above the moon are permanent and uncorrupt. Fairies, Daemones, Jinn are therefore the race of air or fire, native to the space between the earth and the moon. That doesn't mean they always dwell up in the air above the habitations of man, only that they are made of airy or fiery, subtle, mostly invisible stuff, even if they choose to make their dwelling in some mountain, as is often the case, or in the forest. C.S. Lewis, in The Discarded Image, where he ably describes the medieval worldview, refers to this as the first and main understanding of what the fairy is. Now, returning to the idea that some are evil and have bad intentions towards mankind, we find a secondary theory about their origins, which holds that some of the spirits are in fact fallen angels. In the South English Legendary, a collection of English folklore, this view is developed at some length, writes C.S. Lewis.
When Lucifer rebelled, he and his followers were cast into hell. But there were also angels, fellow travelers, who did not actually join the rebellion. These were banished into the lower and more turbulent levels of the airy region. They remain there till doomsday, after which they go to hell. And there was what I suppose we might call a party of the center, angels who were, almost but not quite, guilty of sedition. These were banished, some to the higher and calmer levels of air, some to various places on earth, including the earthly paradise. Both sometimes communicate with men in dreams. The latter will return to heaven at doomsday.
Some, then, are low angels and others are high demons, so to speak. We might actually find something similar in the Quran concerning the possible transformation of angel to jinn, although this contradicts the mainstream interpretation in Muslim theology. But the Quran says that God ordered the angels to bow to Adam, and that Iblis, the devil, refused, which does seem to imply that he was an angel, otherwise he would not be disobeying the order given to the angels. Islamic tradition maintains that he was a jinn among the angels, kind of like Loki among the Aesir in Norse mythology, and we are told that he was of the jinn, but the term for was or is also gets used in contexts where it means become, as with a son of Noah who does not get in the ark during the flood and is of the drowned. Obviously, he was not always drowned. He was alive. Granted, the particle fa, meaning and, or then, so, is missing from the devil verse, but some ambiguity arises from the command to the angels applying to Iblis, suggesting that what fell with the devil was at that time part of the angelic chain of command, but that it was the lower corruptible, sublunary part, the jinn part. We can also point out that the Quran is relating an episode that appears in the Jewish apocryphal Life of Adam and Eve, or Apocalypse of Moses, in which the devil refuses to bow to Adam at God's command, and there the devil is very much an angel initially. Now, symbolically, the idea may be that angels proper cannot fall, because they are archetypes. So, if an angel does fall, he is, by definition, no longer an angel, but a lower creature, a jinn. A mathematical axiom does not stop existing because I misunderstand it. But the thought in my head, corresponding to that axiom, would be a wrong thought. So the jinn portion of the angel falls, but not the angel itself. And Christians don't mean that a fallen angel is the same as an unfallen angel, because they believe that evil is ultimately lower, a mere privation compared to good. Only good has true being, true existence. So these ideas are compatible, and there's a sense in which what the devil really represents is lower corruption that does not truly correspond to any higher, permanent, stable principle, which is why ultimately the devil will cease, even though the earth will be redeemed and transformed. Physicality itself in the resurrection is to be redeemed in Christian and in Islamic theology. A lighter version of this theory is simply to say that the fairies are not fallen angels, but they are fallen in the sense that their original role as mediators between the human and the angelic spheres has been tarnished. A very interesting author by the name of Charles Upton, who's actually a Sufi American mystic and poet, writes the following on this issue.
At the top of the hierarchy of beings are the high angels, who the pagans mistake for actual gods or independent principles. The Jinn, the fairies of Islam and pre-Islamic Arabia, are roughly equivalent to the Greek Daemones, powers of the intermediary or psychic plane, who once served as links between the gods, the Platonic intelligibles, and the material world. At one point, a split developed due to cyclical degeneration between Daemones and the gods, and a second division occurred among the Daemones themselves. That's the point at which the pagan gods began to be progressively transformed into demons, or rather, were replaced by demons. In Indo-European mythology, we encounter a race of beings known to the Hindus as Asuras, to the Norse as Jotun or giants, to the Greeks as the Titans, who are universally considered to be the enemies of the gods.
The Quran contains another very interesting passage in which it's said that the Jinn used to go up to the perch of heaven and look out into heaven, but that they no longer can do that because there are now guards, flaming guards, that throw them back down when they try to ascend. So they used to, apparently, receive prophecies of the future, but they no longer are allowed to do that. There has been a fall. There has been a rebellion and a demotion of this kind of being. Now, the malevolent element of the fairy comes through most of all in accounts of kidnapping humans. Here we have the Muslim American Professor Hamza Yusuf discussing this tradition.
In Arabic, superstition is khurafa. Khurafat are superstitious beliefs. But the Prophet once asked Aisha if she knew who Khurafa was, and she said no, and he said Khurafa was a man who was kidnapped by the jinn, so it was like alien abduction. He was kidnapped by the jinn, taken to Abqar, and he saw all these wondrous things that happened with them, and then when he came back he told people about it and they laughed at him.
This is also common in Irish folklore, where you get the so-called puka, shape-shifting fairy, that often is said to snatch people up.
The puka, who's a 6-foot-tall white rabbit who lives in County Kerry, he hangs around pubs. If you come out of a pub at night, the odds are the puka will jump off behind a tree, grab you, and drag you off into an alternative time. After a couple of thousand years have passed, the puka gets tired of playing with you and lets you go. You're on the road, and it's only a few minutes after you left the pub.
Then there's the idea that the spirits are
the dead, or some special class of the dead.
Some special class of the dead. We might say ghosts, either souls in a temporary purgatory or the residue of dead persons' psyches, like the husk of what once was and has moved on, leaving pieces of its personality lingering in the air in the astral realm. Proclus, the late antique Neoplatonist, reports that some philosophers maintained the Daemones were of three types: good, and aligned with the Olympian gods; bad, trying to corrupt humans, he calls them soul polluters; and human, dead humans who must live a lifetime as a daemon. Perhaps their life was not bad enough to dissolve in Hades or good enough to make it into the Elysian fields, into paradise, in Roman terms.
Their view is that there are three kinds of Daemones: a divine type of demon, a type now in that condition which is made up of individual souls who have received a demonic lot, and the other corrupt kind, the soul polluters.
These are the main theories, then, that we find in medieval and earlier thought. And pre-modern people may have believed all three, namely that most fairies are just a separate species, whereas a minority are fallen angels or ghosts. Now, I would add that there seems to be a special class that's basically a spirit guide. Socrates, for example, talks about his personal daemon.
The customary prophetic monitor always spoke to me very frequently and opposed me even in very small matters. If I was going to do anything, I should not.
The Romans would call this the individual's genius, which interestingly sounds like Jinn. Muslims believe each person has a Kareem, a personal Jinn, and that if one forgets God, one's Kareem will get swapped for a demonic Jinn. Of course, Christians believe in the guardian angel. So how does this relate? Well, we could say that in systems that believe in a guardian angel, the personal daemon is the lower psychological projection, the sublunary manifestation or body of a person's guardian angel, which is ultimately a higher archetype. This also raises the question of how much of the fairy realm consists of extended parts of the human psyche, projections of the human being. So what is the proper function of the Jinn, at least so far as we humans are concerned? The big part seems to be that as mental beings, they participate in the upkeep of nature and the body. Basically administration, from helping with causing rain for the fields to aiding witch doctors in healing the sick. This is where guardian spirits of a place who protect a person's property or home come into the picture, the lares of Roman tradition, for example. Administration as mediation, taking a higher imperative, the order, the command to have humanity on earth, to have humanity prosper and survive, and imposing it on lower material nature. So, for example, bringing rain during a drought to avoid having a human village die of thirst, which would be something that in some tribal societies these spirits would get invoked to do.
When we emerged from the four worlds, we had to bring the witch with us because he had control over the rain cloud.
And we have the folkloric figures that populate Carnival in Europe, especially in the Catholic parts of Europe, to mark the transition from winter into spring. These kind of fantastical creatures that local people will dress up as, and that have some role to play, presumably, in helping nature shift from one season to another. I made a video about this some time ago as well. These would be what St. Paul calls the elementals, lower nature spirits whose proper role is to help nature and humans, like the Greek nymphs said to weave organic life together. But some have become corrupt. In the Bible, the term Elohim is extremely polyvalent. It can mean many different things. Sometimes it means God proper. Sometimes it means angels, but it may also sometimes refer to these lower natural spirits, and indeed in the Psalms we read of the wind and flames being servants and messengers of God. That's probably a reference to lower nature spirits, to elementals. At one point we also read of the divine counsel of God, including a ruach, a spirit. That's probably not an angel, but a lower nature spirit. In the Hebrew cosmovision of the time, these kinds of entities were also included. This constructive role of spirits as helpers comes up in the Jewish apocryphal Testament of Solomon, where the righteous king, Solomon, forces demons to work for him, and the Quran presents a similar account in which jinn were commanded by God to help Solomon with the building of his palace or temple, making sculptures and decoration, and so on. We also have tales of craftsmen being aided by dwarfs in the night. But in these European folk tales, one must not look at the dwarfs, at the fairies, while they work. or else they will leave. It's like how one can fall asleep with a problem in mind. If one thinks about it with the conscious mind, the solution eludes one. But if you let the mental stuff, the subconscious, process the problem, a solution may pop into your mind on its own. Again, these are psychological or mental creatures, so it makes sense they would work similarly to the human mind in folklore and in traditional accounts. What can we conclude? On one level, the lesson these pre-modern beliefs can impart to us is that the fact that a thing is more subtle, less densely physical, less bound by form, less constrained by the body, more spiritual, does not make it more virtuous. In just the same way as the strength of a feeling doesn't make it more true. The complexity or elaboration of a thought doesn't mean that that thought is describing something real. More than one ancient thinker held that any liberation from the body, from the gross and physical existence, was a step up spiritually. And today we have this idea in the myth around UFOs and aliens. More technology means more truth. Progress is good as such. Advancement means leaving behind the body or human particularity.
I've always speculated that aliens could potentially be us in the future. It's less hair, less muscle, bigger head. And then you just keep going. 1,000, 1,000,000, whatever year, or 5 years, whatever happens when Neuralink goes online.
Evolving into a singularity, leaving behind our differences of nations and genders and so forth. In fact, the point of humanity is not to escape the earth, but to be a bridge between the earthly and the heavenly, to bless our particularity. We are not higher than the gods, than the angels, but we are more central. And that's a realization that really dawned on the European mind, for example, with Christianity, albeit the best of the pagans understood it as well. It's not about being high, subtle, more spiritual and less physical. It's about being central, drawing the physical and the spiritual in together. Thus does the Bible have it that humans are exalted in a way that angels are not. But what about that Irish fellow that we started with? The one that decided to spend the night in a fairy fort.
What were you thinking about most down there, Tim?
Oh, when I was away at sea and back from my school days and about friends that was dead.
Would you do it again?
I would, yes.
Okay, thank you for watching. Hope that was interesting, and subscribe if you'd like to.